Hello everyone, my name is Linn. I'm a Microsoft Business Applications MVP, and I'm currently working as the Senior Technical Consultant at DXC Technology in Wellington, New Zealand. It's a really nice privilege to be able to present a slide as one of the sessions in the DynamicsCon, which is the conference for the community by the community. The topic that I would like to present today is about the flows specific to the CDS connectors, do's and don'ts, and the tips to build the effective flows. Even though the title of the session or the connector reference is called the CDS throughout the whole session, it's subject to the name change. As you all know, if you're watching in the video in the future, please try to relate the term CDS with the product called by Microsoft at the point of time. As you all know, Microsoft recommends using the flow instead of the async background workflow in the Dynamics 365. But for someone with the Dynamics 365 workflow knowledge, building the CDS flow seems to be similar, but a bit challenging for the starters. So in this session, I would like to share my knowledge based on the experience of building flows using the CDS connectors. This session has 5 main topics, and the first one is the differences between the Dynamics 365 connector, CDS, and CDS current environment connectors, and when to use which connector. And the second part is about using the filter options in the trigger step to build the effective flows for your CDS. And we will continue with the list action parameters from the select query, filter query, expand query, fetch XML queries, and all these options from the list action. The next part is about setting or getting the field values specific to the CDS records. And we'll conclude with the other tips which are not included in the other topics. So let's start with the first topic, which is about the connectors. So for those who are not familiar with the connectors, what does the connector means in the Power Automate? And in Power Automate, the connectors allow you to use the applications within your organizations in your flows. Some connectors give you access to the applications provided by Microsoft, such as Outlook or SharePoint. And there are also connectors that allow you to integrate third-party applications such as Slack or Twitter. And you can also build custom connectors, but we're not going into that in this session. Since there are multiple connectors available to use for building flows with CDS or Dynamics 365, there are a lot of confusions between the Dynamics 365 consultants or administrators. And the first connector available to use is the Dynamics 365 connector, which has been deprecated since 5th of May this year. And the second connector available for us to use is the CDS connector. Sometimes we call it the CDS standard connector, which we usually use this for scenarios like cross-environment connections or on-demand flows for the selected records. And we have the latest and the greatest flow connector, which is the CDS current environment connector, which we use to build all sorts of CDS related actions, and which is the one recommended by Microsoft because of this better ALM procedures and all these new features available. Getting the right connector and choosing the one in the list of all these connectors, it could be tricky, and previously it was a bit of confusion because both CDS environment connector and CDS connector have the same icon, but that's no longer the case today because the CDS environment connector shows in the first page as feature in the flow selection. But if you have want to use the normal CDS current environment connector, and if you want to differentiate between these two connectors, as you can see in the screenshot on the right side, as one of the CDS connector has the 3 dots at the end. So that means that connector is the CDS current environment connector. And you can see in the list of actions, you can see the whole complete connector name, and you can differentiate between the actions between the two different CDS connector. First of all, we will explain about the latest CDS current environment connector, because this is the most recommended connector by Microsoft. And Microsoft mentioned in one of their blog posts that it should be the first choice of the building your flows, and only if you cannot achieve some of your actions using this connector, you should consider the other CDS standard connector. Why Microsoft recommend this is, one of the reasons is when we use this CDS current environment connector, and if we import it into another environment, the solution, the flows in the solution will automatically activate it without having to go and reauthorize the connections, just like the other connectors. And CDS current environment connector has also have the all-in-one trigger. Well, you can use the both create, update, and delete all triggers in one specific flow without having to use the parent-child flows for triggering from multiple events. And we also have the advanced option in the trigger for the filter and the run as user, which we will mention later in this session. Microsoft has made a lot of changes to the CDS current environment connector when they are adding the new features such as execute a change set request, getting or upload the file or image content, perform a bound unbound action, and predict with the AI model, relate unrelated records. All these actions Microsoft only add in the CDS current environment connector, and they no longer make any change to the CDS standard connector. The other advantage of CDS current environment connector is the usage of the better query, using the select query to filter the fields that you only want. And also for the complex queries, we can use the fetch XML in this connector. For those actions which are not available with the CDS current environment connector, we can use the old CDS connector. Sometimes we call this the standard CDS connector. One of the most used case that we use for this standard CDS service connector is when we integrate with the other Dynamics 365 or CDS environments. And if we use that connector, we can create or update all the records in the different environments, which is currently not yet available in CDS current environment connector. And there are other certain scenarios which are not possible with the current environment connector, such as on-demand trigger for the selected records, and setting the null value to the lookup in the update record, and using the logic apps. Microsoft has the deprecation plan to deprecate both Dynamics 365 and CDS connector and keep only one single connector, which is the CDS current environment connector in the future. But currently there is no deprecation date announced for the CDS standard connector yet. And the last one is the Dynamics 365 connector. So when do we use the Dynamics 365 connector? The answer is never, because friends don't let friends use Dynamics 365 connector, and it has been deprecated since 5th of May 2020. And there is a
this configuration plan for this connector, and you should stop creating the new connections with the Dynamics 365 connector. And you should convert the old flows whenever you have a chance. To conclude this topic, we should always try to use the CDS current environment connector as much as possible. You may use the CDS standard connector whenever there are some functionality which are not available yet in the CDS current environment connector, and will never use the Dynamics 365 connector anymore. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is about the trigger parameters. In this topic, we'll cover about the filtering attributes, filter expressions, and the trigger connections to optimize the trigger of the CDS connectors. One of the first tips that I would like to talk about is always set the filtering attributes for the update triggers. In that way, you can avoid the unnecessary flow runs for your flow. For example, in this sample flow, this will only trigger when one of the email address of the contact is updated, and it will not be triggered when the record is updated for phone or other address fields and other contact information. It also helps you avoid the infinite loop, because sometimes it can happen when you trigger the flow and you update the same record, and it will trigger the flow again and again. And you can avoid these kind of scenarios by filtering the attributes that your flow is running. And the next one is only the new feature, which is only available for the flows and not available in the standard classic workflow, which is the filter expression. So in this filter expression, what we can use is we can specify the auditor filter expression query to trigger the flow only when the condition of the specific value meets what we specify in the filter expression. And one of the things is it works not only for the update event, but it also works for the create event as well. It is better than triggering the flow for all field change and terminate it within the condition branch, because if you do it that way, you have a lot of flow triggers in the flow run history with the terminate options, and you will see a lot of unnecessary flow run in your flow run history. By doing so, you will have a cleaner flow run history which only shows the relevant ones. One of the sample scenarios that we can use is if you want to trigger the flow only when the case is canceled. Normally, case entity has in progress, on hold, or waiting for details, or problem solve a lot of status. And if you don't specify the filter expression, it will trigger for all the status change. And if you want to filter the trigger only for specific status change, you can specify in the filter expression. And the same thing for the record creation. Maybe one of the example is when you want to trigger the account record creation only when there is no value in the parent account lookup. So we can specify all these conditions in the filter expression. But this filter expression is only available in the CDS current environment connector. And if you're using the CDS standard connector, another option is to use the flow trigger parameter settings. in order to specify the trigger parameters, you have to click on the ellipsis of this trigger and click on the settings, and you can see on the right side of the screenshot where you can specify the trigger conditions. The trigger conditions start with the add symbol followed by the filter expression used in the trigger outputs. But the differences between the filter expression that I mentioned just now and this trigger conditions is that in the trigger conditions, you can only use the values contained in the trigger outputs of the body. And trigger conditions is not specific to the CDS connector. It can be used in other connectors such as Outlook or SharePoint as well. In summary, we can use the filtering attributes and in summary, we can use the filtering attributes, filter expressions, and trigger conditions for non-CDS current environment connector to optimize the trigger of the flow of the CDS records. The next topic that I would like to talk about is the list action parameters of the CDS current environment connector. Over there, we have the select query, filter query, expand, and fetch XML query, and I will explain how to make use of them to list the records efficiently. First of all, always try to populate the select query for the list records. As Sarah Lagerquist mentioned in one of her blog posts, the list record action is not a buffet, it is an a la carte menu. And you do not order the whole menu of foods and then pick and choose what to eat. Yeah, that would be too expensive, and you'll have to decide beforehand what to order and make sure you consume it all. If you want to learn more about that, you can refer to her blog post as mentioned at the bottom of the slide. Limiting the number of fields in the select query not only improves the performance of the flow, but also it only shows the only relevant fields in the dynamic content pane in the step below. So you don't have to go through the endless list of fields when you choose one of the dynamic content in the steps below. For example, here I just only specify the select query on the left side. And when you choose the dynamic content in the next step below, it will only show this full name from this particular step. But if we set the select query for lookups, it can be a little bit tricky because of how the auditor query works. And in one of my suggestions is to add both the lookup field name and the underscore lookup fee underscore value in the select query. So as you can see on the left-hand side, there I added both the created by and the underscore created by underscore value in this list accounts action. If you don't, the later part of the underscore lookup fee underscore value is how it's going to retrieve the actual data. But if you don't specify the first part of the field name, it will not be available in the dynamic field list. And we don't have to specify in this for the fetch XML query, because in the fetch XML query, only the fields specified in the query will return as the result, and we don't have to specifically mention in the select query. And building the filter query can be a bit tricky for citizen developers, especially if you're not familiar with the standard query functions of the web API. And it's worse when we don't have to use the CDS specific web API query functions, such as the value contains and the date is within last X months. In this sample query, I tried to query the accounts where the status is active, and the name starts with A, and the primary contact is matching one of the values, UID values. It can be a bit tricky if you want to just type everything and get it right at the first time. So for me, I personally use one of the tools from the community, the Fetch XML Builder from the XIM toolbox. And it is really easy to build such kind of query. It is really similar to the advanced find. You can just specify what fields you want, what is the filter conditions, and after that, you click on the view and automate parameters, and you can see at the very pop-up box window at the below, as mentioned, and you can just copy this filter query, and you can just straight away use it. And one of the parameters available in this tool is the expand query. By using this expand query, what we can do is we can get the related data from the related entity. Traditionally, without using the expand query, we'll have to trigger another get a record action to get the related entity. For example, I want to list the records account and I want to get the data from the primary contact of this account as well. I have to use the two separate actions to list accounts and another get records to get the primary contact. But by using the expand query, what we can do is we can specify the fields required in the primary contact within the expand query. And once we specify that in the next step, we can see all these fields available in this dynamic value list. And the format will be like the lookup name of the field and the field name on the related entity. One of the use case of this getting the expand query is getting the lookup name. In the classic workflow, we used to build the name of the records by appending the fee values from the related entity or the current entity. And in this scenario, I try to compose the case title based on the related entity of the 3 different entities. It works really fine in one single step in the classic workflow, but we can achieve the same functionality using the expand query in flow by expand query of the 3 different entities. And we can select from the dynamic values and fill up in the next update step. But sometimes it can be a bit tricky because the expand query doesn't always return the value in the dynamic list, field list for you to choose in the next step. Especially one of the scenario is the polymorphic lookups, or if you want to get the expand query of the multi-level relationship, you want to get the created by user name of the primary contact of the account. In this kind of scenarios, this field is not available to be chosen in the dynamic value list. And the expand query for the child records is also a different story and it's not available to be in the dynamic value list. In this kind of scenarios, what you can do is first you have to run this list record actions for the first to get the output JSON. Once you get the output JSON, you can add the burst JSON action, and you can generate the schema from the sample output JSON that you get in the previous step. And you can use the output of the dynamic values of this output JSON in the next step below. But the downside of this is the output JSON will only return you the fields in the logical name and not in the citizen developer friendly display name of the field. If you want to learn more about how you want to do this, you can refer to the link as mentioned at the bottom of the slide. And as I mentioned just now, if we want to use the multi-level entity relationship for the expand query, you cannot do it with just using the field values will not be available in the dynamic value list. In this case, what you can do is you can either use the burst JSON action, as I mentioned in the previous slide, or if you're brave enough to write your own flow expression, you can write the related expand query based on the slash for the lookup name. Okay, let's see in this example, the first one is account name. Okay, we just get the name directly. We can choose from the dynamic value list. The second one is we're getting the last name of the primary contact, which is still available in the dynamic value list. But the third one that we're trying to get is the primary contact created by user's first name, which is exists in the 2-level up relationship of the current entity. And in that case, what you have to do is you have to write your own flow expression, and the first lookup primary contact ID slash second lookup, which is on the primary contact created by slash and the required records attribute name, which is the field name. So in that way, if you do the more nested queries like 3-level up, 4-level up, or 5-level up, you can achieve the same way using adding more slash and more lookups. If you want to learn more, you can find out in the link mentioned in the bottom of the slide. And if you're if the query is really complex and if it's not achievable with the OData query, we can use the fetch XML query. And it's easy to get the fetch XML because we can use the advanced find and we can just download the fetch XML from the advanced find. And we can also use the fetch XML builder from the XML toolbox. In this topic, we learn about how to use the select query and filter the queries and using the expand query to get the field from the related entities and using the fetch XML query for the complex scenarios. Then we'll move on to the next topic about getting or setting the field values. In this topic, you will learn about how to get the particular count or first record of the collection result from the list action, and how to set the dynamic content in the expression or setting the lookup fields. As I mentioned, we have the list record actions, and we want to do certain actions. And for if the record result is more than 0, in this scenario, we can create a one condition step, and we use the length function to check the number of record counts from the previous step. And another common scenario that we usually encounter is trying to get the record which will only have the one record return. Let's say I want to retrieve the business unit, which is called the root business unit. In that scenario, I know that there will be only one record returned from the record, and I know that there will be one record available in the system because this is the master or reference data that I set up in the system. If we just use this business unit output from the previous step, what we will get is the flow will be intelligent enough to put it into the apply to each block because the output of the list record action is an array. And in order to avoid this kind of scenario, what we can use is to use the first expression, first function to get the output of the list action records, and we'll get the business unit ID from this first action function. But if we use this kind of expression in the dynamic content, it can be a little bit tricky because sometimes we enter this expression and we try to change to the tab to get the dynamic content. The field that we want to use is not available in this list. For example, here we can see there's a body and value from the list account records, but there's no other field to be selected. In those cases, what we can do is we just add one step, one compose step, or any step, and we just use the field name from the list records. And for example, I just added the account name, and I use this ellipsis and select the big codes, and I get the actual flow expression of that particular field. And the alternative way of getting this flow expression is you can put the cursor in this text box beside that field, dynamic content, and you can just press Ctrl A to select all and press Ctrl C to copy. Once you get this flow expression, we can simply copy that without the add sign, add symbol at the first, and then we can use it in the expression without any issue. If you are having trouble with this flow expression builder, one of the solution is to start using the new expression builder. In order to do so, you have to click on the settings and view all Power Automate settings and turn on the experimental features. And once you click save, it will refresh automatically. And voila, you have the new expression builder, which is more intuitive and more better experience of building the flow expressions. One of the next step, which was recently available in the CDS current environment connector, is getting the formatted value. What is getting the formatted value means we have this lookup, date and time, and these option set labels. The system would previously return the backend data of in the system. And this is one of the big capability gap between the classic workflows and the Power Automate flows, that we can easily get the name of the lookup or the label of the option set field. But now we can achieve that by appending this at odata.community.display.v1.formatted value at the end of the field name. So how you can do is you can use it to use the same way that how you build your dynamic content in the flow expression in the previous slide. You can use the same way to build your own flow expressions and append this text at the end of the field name. If you need more help, you can refer to my blog post as mentioned at the bottom of the slides. And one of the features that are available for in Dynamics 365 or CDS is sending the email to the records which are not available in the system. For example, we are just going to send an email to someone, but this email address is not existing in the CDS or Dynamics 365 as a contact or account or any lead or user record. In those cases, we can use the address use, but we need to build the JSON object for this whole activity bodies. In order to do so, we have to click on this JSON builder at the create email action step, and it will show this one big chunk, the text box, instead of the small places to small text boxes to fill up the lookup value. And once you get this interface, you can use the address use and the email address to send the email to the activity body with just email address. And yeah, here comes the good part. For all the users who are starting to use the CDS current environment connector, have those moments of Googling up how to set the lookup value, because when you set the lookup value as it is, it's not working. In the CDS standard connector, setting the lookup value can be as easy as setting the GUID and specify the lookup name for the entity logical name in the dropdown. But it's more a bit tricky in the CDS current environment connector, because if you just set the GUID, it will throw the error, and you have to specify the entity set name, open brackets, GUID, and the close brackets. That's the format of how you set the lookup field in the CDS current environment connector. And this entity set name, things to take note, is not a proper plural. You can't assume that it will generate as the plural display name of your entity. For example, in one of the projects I use, we have this entity called client journey, and the entity set name turned out to be client journeys and with IES, which is not what we expected it would be. If you want to know more about the entity set name, you can be searched in the web API URL if you are more technical or developer, or if you are more of a functional side or a citizen developer. You can use the metadata browser for Dynamics 365 extension for Chrome. You can just go and download it, and you can select the entity, and you have all these entity metadata information where you can see the entity set name. If you want to know more about, yeah, as usual, just go to the blog post as mentioned in the end of the bottom of this slide. Same as setting the lookup value, clearing the lookup value is also another problem. In the standard CDS connector, we can just set the null value and it will just clear the field. But in the CDS current environment connector, it is a little bit more tricky because we have to use the unrelate action. And how do we can only clear up one lookup field at a time, because we have to use this unrelate action for one field, lookup field at a time. How do we use it is, let's say I want to clear the primary contact field from the account. So the first one is not the current record. The first field entity name is for the entity name of the lookup field. So in this case, it's a primary contact, so it is a contact. And the second box is the item ID, which is the GUID of this lookup field. Yeah, we need to know the ID to clear the ID field. Well, that's the CDS current environment connector limitation. We can get away with it. And the third one is the relationship from this current records to this lookup. For example, here is the account, primary, and contact. You can choose from the dropdown, so it wouldn't go wrong. And the last part is a little bit more interesting. It is the auditor ID. It is the URL of the current record. So normally you can get the URL from the steps above for getting from the auditor ID dynamic value from the getter record or list record actions. Let's see, this is the output of one of the flow runs. As you can see, the first one is contact and the GUID of that contact and the record relationship and the record URL of that particular account. And even though I mentioned that we can use the auditor ID to get the URL, the auditor ID in the trigger step is somehow always returned empty, even though you are allowed to select it from the dynamic value list. So in that scenario, you'll either have to build your own auditor ID, or you'll have to use the get record action to get the auditor ID. The next part is about the setting the nullable lookup value. What is the nullable lookup value means? It's a dynamic value from another step, which can be null or which can have a value. In the standard CDS connector, we can just set this value, and it will just work because if the value comes as a GUID, it will set the GUID, and if the value is null, it will just set the null value and it will just work. But it's a little bit more tricky in the CDS current environment connector because we have to do the prefix of the entity set name on all these brackets. So before we set the value, we have to check if the value is empty or not. And only if the value is not empty, we set the empty string. And otherwise, you have to set the entity name using the concatenation of the entity set name and the GUID and all these brackets. Yeah, as I mentioned, you can see in the more details in my blog post at the end, at the bottom of the slide. And if you're agreed that if setting this null value and all these things are really not citizen developer friendly and it is really hard, and a lot of my colleagues complain about setting the entity set name, like it's a lot harder than how they built in the classic workflow. So if you agree with that, go to the Spark Automate IDEA and go and upvote my IDEA so that the product team can improve the CDS current environment connector. Well, in this topic, we learn a lot about getting and setting a few values, such as getting the record count, getting the first record, and setting the dynamic content in the expressions, setting lookup fields, or clearing the lookup fields. The last stop that I would like to talk is the other tips, which does not fall into the other previous categories. And some of the slides in this topic will be just explaining about the possibility of the specific scenario in a high level. And you will have to read through more details in the accompanying blog posts at the bottom of each slide if you want to get more details into it. The first one is including the record URL in the email. In classic workflow, where it's really easy because we can use the dynamic record URL as one of the parameters available, and we can just use that parameter to get the record URL in the email address. But in the flow, we have to build the URL by ourselves. So there are three main components included in the URL. One of the thing is our host name of our environment. The second part is the app ID, because we are using the unified interface and we have the GUID of each specific model-driven app. Otherwise, the link will redirect to the last model-driven app that the user used. And the last part is the GUID, which is we can easily get it from the retrieve or on the previous step above. So I'll explain a bit more about the first two. And the first one is composing the environment host name, which is the current environment URL. And as I mentioned previously, we have this auditor ID parameter of one of those steps, which is the URL of the current record. So you can use the URI host function to use the URL, the first domain part of your current environment using that function. The second part is getting the GUID of the small driven app. And as just like the other records, the more driven apps is one of the records, and you can just query it using the unique ID of this more driven app. And in that way, you can build the record URL in the email address. Once you build the URL in the email address and you want to create the email attachment, yeah, you can do it in the flow too, but it's a little bit different from creating other records. Because one of the thing is there's an attachment lookup field, which is the mandatory field, but we are not supposed to fill, which is supposed to be automatically generated by the system. So as you can see in the screenshot, there's the attachment lookup field is the second text box. So what you can do is you can set it empty by using the empty string to single quotes. And another tricky part is setting the entity object type code, which is the fifth in the screenshot with fifth second. If you choose from the list available, it will just throw an error. So what you have to do is you have to specify the string called email, which is the logical name of the email entity. And once it's done, yep, you can just create the email attachment using the CDS current environment connector. And after that, we'll move on to the tips which are related to the troubleshooting the flows. So you're not just building the flows. We have a lot of time troubleshooting your own flows, and most of the time, I have to find the flow run of the particular record. So what I normally do is to find the time of the record last modified on, and match with the flow run history and find out the flow record. And then I check if this record has the correct GUID of the record in the body, and to make sure that I am selecting the correct flow run. But it is not always the case. If the record is modified again after the flow run, then the modify on of the record will not be matched with the flow run history, date, and time. In that case, you have to download the flow run history into the CSV file. And once you have downloaded the CSV file, you go and search the record GUID in the flow run in the Excel, and then you can find the particular flow run URL from this row on the same row. And another thing that we usually encounter while we're troubleshooting the flow is getting the status reason 200 instead of the output JSON of this particular action. It happens to me a lot when the return result is only one record or only a few records for the list record action. In those cases, if you have a chance to rerun the flow, you can use the compose action to show up the output JSON. If you don't have the chance to rerun the flow, if you're doing in the production, what you can do is just I mentioned just now, you can download the CSV file and find this particular record ID to get the URL of this JSON output. But downloading the flow run history is only limited to the 100 records. So if you want to find some records which are trigger a few 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, you cannot achieve if there are more than 100 records. In order to do so, there is a solution that I use one of the custom connector from the community. And by specifying the flow name and this record UID, it go and find this record flow run URL and output at the end of the flow. So if you're interested and keen to find out, you can check out my blog post as mentioned at the bottom of the slide. Well, getting the flow runs is a bit tricky because we need to run and we need to find out getting the custom connectors, and it's sometimes I really miss the old days where the classic workflow, we have this background process list, which is related to the particular records. Well, the good news is that you can replicate the same functionality using the flow, but it is not out of the box available at the moment, and you will have to build your own. And the high level mechanism of how you can achieve is you just create one of the custom activity, and we have this subgrid for this custom activity in the particular record. And every time the flow is triggered, we have to log all this information. What is the flow run URL? What's the date and time? And what is the success and status of this flow run? And this part is about more of the difference between the CDS connector and CDS current environment connector and CDS standard connector. So as I mentioned in the very beginning of this session, if you import the flow using the CDS current environment connector only to the another environment, it will automatically on, as you can see in the third row with the green circle, and it is on as soon as you import it to the environment. But if you have a bit of mix between the CDS and CDS current environment connector, you will be prompted with, it will be off, but you will be prompted only one time to edit the flow and authorize the connections. Once you click continue and save the record, your flow will just work. But there's a bit more tricky if your flow only contains the CDS standard connector only. And in that case, you will have to go and authorize each and every step of the connections in the CDS connector, just like the other connectors. Well, hopefully we will have all these things fixed with the modern solution import experience that Microsoft is going to introduce as part of the 2020 Wave 1. And in this way, we can have and specify all these connections used in the solution during the import of the solution. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching this video, and thanks to DynamicsCon for letting me participate in this opportunity to share with the community. If you want to learn more about it, you can follow my blog post at linzorwinn.blogspot.com, or you can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and you can reach out to me if you have any question. Thank you.